The air inside the auction barn was thick with the mingling scents of hay, sweat, and the distant, pungent trace of manure. Dust hung in the golden beams of late afternoon light filtering through the rafters, swirling lazily as boots scuffed the packed dirt floor. The crowd was rowdy, a mix of seasoned ranchers, wealthy breeders, and casual onlookers drawn by the spectacle. Laughter boomed through the space, punctuated by the occasional sharp bark of an auctioneer's voice cutting through the chatter like a whip crack. The horses in the holding pens were a fine collection, sleek thoroughbreds with gleaming coats, muscular quarter horses bred for speed and power, and towering Clydesdales with feathered hooves that stomped the earth with authority. They pranced and tossed their heads, nostrils flaring, eyes bright with spirit. And then, standing alone, there was him. A Mustang, if one could still call him that. His coat was a dull, lifeless brown, marred by patches of missing hair where his ribs threatened to push through. His stance was awkward, legs too thin, hooves cracked and neglected. His eyes, half-lidded with exhaustion, held none of the fire one expected from his breed. His mane hung in tangled clumps, and his tail, thinning at the ends, barely twitched at the flies crawling over his skin. The ranchers barely spared him a glance, and those who did scoffed openly. "Jesus, they bring in skeletons to auction now," one man sneered, nudging his companion, who snorted into his beer. "That thing ain't worth the dirt it's standin' on." Another chuckled, shaking his head. "Hell, I wouldn't take it if they paid me." A woman in a crisp denim jacket wrinkled her nose. "Looks like he crawled out of some backyard hellhole. Nobody's been feedin' that thing." The Mustang barely flicked an ear at the jeers. He stood motionless, head low, resigned. As if he already knew, had always known, that he was nothing to them. Nothing but a joke. The auctioneer, a burly man with sweat darkening the brim of his hat, sighed heavily as he wiped his forehead. He was eager to move on, to get past this embarrassing offering and onto the real moneymakers. He rapped the wooden podium with his gavel, signaling the start of bidding. "All right, folks, next up we got..." He hesitated, glancing at the Mustang with barely concealed disdain. "This one." A ripple of laughter swept through the crowd. The auctioneer cleared his throat, forcing professionalism. "Mustang. 5 years old, best guess. Need some care?" He barely masked his skepticism. "All right, let's start at $300. Who'll give me 3? Silence. Not just silence, but pointed silence. In the back, a few men grinned, arms firmly crossed over their broad chests. Some leaned in to murmur amongst themselves, the occasional chuckle slipping through. Others simply watched in amusement, waiting for the inevitable moment when the auctioneer would have to drop the price again. All right, the auctioneer muttered, clearing his throat. 250, who'll take him for 250? Nothing. The Mustang shifted slightly, lifting one weary hoof before setting it back down with a soft thud. One of the wealthier ranchers, a man in a pristine white shirt and an expensive Stetson, chuckled under his breath. "Couldn't give that thing away," he muttered to the man beside him. "Put a bullet in it, save the hassle." More laughter, louder now. The auctioneer sighed heavily, shaking his head. He tapped the podium again, eyes scanning the crowd for anyone willing to take this problem off his hands. "All right, folks, $200. That's a steal for any good-hearted soul looking for a project." More silence. James Carter stood near the back of the crowd, arms loose at his sides, his fingers twitching slightly as he watched. Unlike the others, he wasn't laughing. He wasn't scoffing. He wasn't turning away in disgust. He saw the Mustang really saw him. He saw the way the animal didn't flinch at the insults, didn't fight, didn't even hope. And somehow, that quiet surrender hit him harder than any proud stallion kicking against his lead rope ever could. James wasn't a wealthy man. His farm was barely scraping by. But he knew desperation when he saw it. He knew what it was to feel forgotten, to be overlooked, to have people sneer at what you were worth because they had already decided for you. He took a breath, then raised his hand. 200, he said, voice steady. The auctioneer nearly stumbled over his own words. "We got 200, do I hear 250? Silence again, but this time it carried a different weight. The murmuring had stopped. A few heads turned toward James, eyebrows raised. A few outright laughed. "James, you serious?" someone called, still chuckling. "Hell, I'll sell you my dead mule for a better price." More laughter, a couple of mock cheers. Another voice chimed in. "You fixins to start a horse rescue, Carter? Need us to pitch in for the charity case?" James ignored them. His gaze never left the Mustang. 200, going once, the auctioneer said, shaking his head. Going twice. Another pause, another sweeping glance over the crowd. No one else was bidding. He rapped the gavel down with finality. Sold to James Carter for $200. A few exaggerated cheers went up, mocking in their enthusiasm. A couple of men clapped their hands in jest, shaking their heads at the fool who had just wasted his money. James didn't care. He pushed through the crowd, making his way toward the pen where the Mustang stood. The jeers faded into background noise, unimportant. As James approached, the Mustang barely lifted his head. Those dark, tired eyes met his, void of expectation. James exhaled. "Come on, boy," he murmured, voice low, steady. "Let's get you out of here." And for the first time, the Mustang moved. Not because he was forced, not because of fear, but because someone had finally seen him. The trailer rattled and swayed as Shadow stood inside, his thin frame tense, his breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. Every jolt of the road made him flinch, his hooves scuffing against the metal floor as he fought the instinct to bolt. But there was nowhere to go. He was trapped. Just like before. James kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching as the Mustang stood stiff and frozen. His daughter, Lily, sat beside him, her small hands gripping the straps of her overalls as she leaned forward, peering through the back window. "He's scared, Dad," she murmured. "I know." James tightened his grip on the wheel. "But we're gonna fix that." It was nearly dark by the time they pulled into the ranch. The place wasn't much, just a few acres of rough land, a sagging barn that James did his best to maintain, and a handful of horses, none of them particularly valuable. He didn't have money for fine stock, but what he had he cared for. That was more than Shadow had ever known. James stepped out of the truck and moved to the trailer, unfastening the latch as slowly as possible. The moment the door creaked open, Shadow lunged back, eyes rolling white, nostrils flaring as if he expected the worst. His body trembled, and the rope that held him stretched taut as he pulled against it, muscles straining. "Easy, boy," James murmured, stepping inside. Shadow's breathing turned ragged. His ribs stuck out beneath his ragged coat, his body too weak for a fight but his spirit too broken to trust. James didn't move any closer. He just stood there, holding the lead rope loosely, waiting. Lily appeared at his side, quiet and careful. "Does he have a name?" James exhaled. "Shadow," he said after a long moment. "Because that's all he is right now, a shadow of what he should be." Lily's face softened. "He's gonna be more than that." James hoped she was right. It took nearly an hour to coax Shadow from the trailer. The second his hooves touched dirt, he froze, nostrils flaring wildly as he took in the new surroundings. He jerked his head, trying to shake free of the rope, but James held firm. "Not gonna hurt you," he murmured. "You ain't got to run no more." But Shadow didn't believe him. The first few days at the ranch were a battle of will. James and Lily kept their distance, letting Shadow settle into the small corral, giving him space. But even with food and shelter, the Mustang remained rigid with fear, refusing to let them near. He ate only when no one was watching, drinking just enough to survive. The other horses wandered close to his pen, curious about the newcomer. A sturdy chestnut gelding named Rusty stood by the fence line, ears pricked forward, tail swishing lazily. Shadow ignored him. He ignored everything. On the third day, James brought a bucket of oats, setting it down just inside the corral. Shadow didn't move. James took a step back, then another. He turned and walked away. The moment his back was turned, Shadow lunged forward, devouring the grain as if it might disappear any second. James nodded to himself. One step at a time. But not everyone was so patient. At the feed store later that week, James overheard the ranchers talking. "Still got that wreck of a horse?" one of them drawled, tipping his hat back. "Ain't seen you ride him yet?" James ignored him, stacking feed bags onto the truck. A second man chuckled. "Reckon that thing'll ever be worth a damn? Shoulda saved your money, Carter. That horse ain't never gonna be nothin'." James' jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to it. Another man laughed. "Bet it's just sittin' in your corral, too scared to blink. Hell, maybe it's smarter than it looks. Probably knows it ain't got a future." The laughter burned, but James forced himself to stay calm. Words didn't matter. Actions did. But the doubts crept in. Back home, Shadow stood at the far end of the corral, watching James warily as he approached. He didn't run, but he didn't come closer either. James crouched near the fence, setting the bucket down. He didn't move. Didn't speak. Just let the silence stretch. After what felt like an eternity, Shadow flicked an ear. Lily, watching from the barn, held her breath. Then, ever so slowly, Shadow took a step forward. A small step. James didn't push. He didn't expect miracles. He simply existed near Shadow, letting the Mustang decide for himself whether or not to trust. The days stretched into weeks, each one a slow, grinding battle of patience. He would sit by the fence, hat pulled low, hands resting on his knees, while Shadow stood as far away as possible, his dark eyes flicking toward James only when he thought the man wasn't looking. Lily spent hours with her father, always the hopeful one. "He just needs a friend, Dad," she would say, leaning against James' arm, her small hands gripping the wood of the fence. "He's just scared." James never doubted that. But fear ran deep, and Shadow had spent too long learning that people meant pain. Trust wasn't going to come easy. The ranchers didn't let up. Every trip into town came with laughter, with mocking grins and slow shakes of the head. "Still got that charity case, Carter?" one man drawled, slapping dust off his gloves. "You training him to be a scarecrow, or you just keeping him for decoration?" Another snorted, shifting his chewing tobacco from one side of his mouth to the other. "Hell, I seen fence posts with more spirit than that thing. Bet he just stands there all day like a ghost, waitin' to drop dead." James let it roll off his back. Words didn't matter. But Lily, standing beside him at the feed store one afternoon, clenched her fists. "They don't know him," she whispered, her voice shaking. James rested a hand on her shoulder. "They don't have to," he murmured. "We do." Back home, Shadow was waiting at the far end of the corral, his thin frame still tense, but something had shifted. He no longer startled when James walked near. He still didn't come close, but he was watching now. Really watching. The breakthrough came in the quietest way. It was near sundown, the sky burning orange and pink, when James crouched by the fence like always. He had no food, no rope, no tricks. Just his presence. The dirt was warm beneath him, the day's heat still clinging to the earth. Shadow took a step. James didn't move. Another step. The Mustang's nostrils flared, his muscles twitching as if he was fighting every instinct screaming at him to run. He hesitated, one hoof hovering midair, then placed it down. Another. And then, for the first time, Shadow was standing right in front of him. Close enough that James could feel the warmth of his breath, close enough that he could see the scars crisscrossing the Mustang's face. Old wounds, the kind left behind by hard hands and cruel lessons. James swallowed. "Hey boy," he murmured. Shadow snorted but didn't back away. James reached out, slow as molasses, giving him every chance to leave. But Shadow held his ground. His body was tight as a bowstring, ready to spring away at the first sign of danger. But he stayed. James' fingers brushed against Shadow's muzzle, light as a whisper. The Mustang jerked his head, nostrils flaring, but he didn't bolt. He didn't lash out. He just stood there, eyes darting, searching, waiting for the catch, the punishment, the pain that always followed human touch. It didn't come. James pulled his hand back, letting the moment be enough. Letting Shadow decide. The next day, Shadow let him touch his muzzle again. 2 days later, James was brushing the dust from his coat, feeling the ridges of bone beneath his fingers. A week after that, Shadow took an apple from Lily's outstretched palm, his lips hesitant, his ears flicking back and forth as if expecting a trick. But Lily just beamed, her excitement barely contained. "See, Dad," she whispered. "He's learning." But the rest of town wasn't impressed. Still can't ride him, can ya? One of the ranchers sneered when James picked up supplies. All that sittin' around doin' nothin', and for what? That horse ain't never gonna work a day in his life. Ain't got the heart for it. James didn't answer. He didn't have to. Back at the ranch, he stood in the corral, holding a lead rope. Shadow stood just a few feet away, his dark eyes flicking to the rope, then back to James. He knew what it meant. He had worn ropes before, and they had always meant pain. But James didn't move toward him. Instead, he crouched low, setting the rope in the dirt. Shadow watched him. Minutes passed. Then, with a slow exhale, Shadow stepped forward and touched the rope. Lily gasped. James smiled. It wasn't much. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carried the scent of damp earth and fresh hay. The sun had barely climbed over the hills when James walked out to the corral, saddle blanket draped over one arm. Shadow stood near the fence, ears flicking forward the moment he saw James approaching. He wasn't the same hollow-eyed, beaten-down creature from the auction. He had filled out some, his ribs no longer quite so sharp, his coat beginning to regain a healthy sheen. But the ghosts of his past still lingered in his cautious gaze, in the way his body stayed tense, ready to run. James didn't rush. He never did. He let Shadow watch him, let the Mustang see the blanket, smell it, get used to its presence. Then, ever so slowly, he reached out and touched Shadow's back with the fabric. The Mustang stiffened but didn't bolt. James felt the breath he hadn't realized he was holding slip from his lungs. Lily, perched on the fence, grinned. "He's not scared, Dad." "He's still scared," James murmured, smoothing the blanket down along Shadow's spine. "But he's learning to trust." The work continued, slow and steady. James never forced anything. Every new step was Shadow's choice. The first time James laid the saddle across his back, Shadow flinched, muscles rippling beneath his coat. But he didn't run. He stood there, breath sharp and quick, as if waiting for pain that never came. James left the saddle there for only a few moments before removing it, scratching behind Shadow's ears like he would any other horse. The Mustang exhaled hard, shaking his mane. "You're doing all right, boy," James murmured. The next time, the saddle stayed longer. Then came the girth strap, cinched loosely at first, then tighter as the days passed. Shadow's instincts screamed at him to fight, but James' patience had taught him something new. Not all hands were cruel, not all men wanted to break him. It was near sundown when James swung into the saddle for the first time. Lily held her breath, her fingers gripping the fence so tight her knuckles turned white. Shadow tensed, every muscle in his body bracing for an attack. For the first time in his life, a man sat on his back without ropes, without a whip, without pain. It confused him. His ears flicked, his breathing sharp and uneven, his hooves shifting against the dirt as if unsure what he was supposed to do. James didn't move. He just let the Mustang feel his weight, let him realize there was no battle to be fought. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, James tapped his heels lightly against Shadow's sides. The Mustang hesitated. Then, as if remembering something buried deep in his bones, he stepped forward. Lily gasped. James smiled. The Mustang, once discarded as worthless, was carrying a rider. Word spread fast. At the feed store the next week, the ranchers leaned against the counter, smirking as James walked in. "Heard you finally got that bag of bones to move," one of them drawled. "What's next, Carter? Gonna teach him to fly?" Another man chuckled. "You think anyone's gonna care? That horse ain't never gonna be worth a dime." James didn't answer. He didn't have to. Shadow was proving them wrong. The next ride was easier. And the one after that. Soon, they were moving through the fields, Shadow's stride growing stronger, his head lifting higher. The fear in his eyes was fading, replaced by something else, something new. Confidence. Lily rode Rusty beside them, watching with wide-eyed wonder. "I told you, Dad," she whispered. "He just needed a friend." James ran a hand down Shadow's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath his fingers. "No," he murmured. "He just needed someone to believe in him." The sun was barely cresting the hills when James tightened the cinch on Shadow's saddle. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, dirt, and anticipation. Riders and horses filled the starting area, the tension humming like an electric wire. This wasn't just any race. It was the annual cross-county endurance run, 50 miles of grueling terrain, river crossings, and steep climbs. The kind of race that separated true horsemen from the ones who just threw money at their problems. And the prize? $10,000. Enough to save James' struggling ranch, to patch the holes in the barn roof, to keep the feed bins full for another season. James stroked Shadow's neck. The Mustang stood calm, his ears flicking at the sounds around him but his body steady. He wasn't the scrawny, broken thing James had bought at the auction anymore. His muscles were lean but strong, his coat had a deep, healthy sheen, and his eyes held something that hadn't been there before, determination. A sharp laugh broke through the air. "You actually showed up, Carter?" James turned. Foster. The same Foster who had stood at the auction, laughing at Shadow, calling him worthless. The same Foster who had spent years making sure everyone knew he was the best rancher around, flashing his wealth like a badge of honor. He sat atop his stallion, a towering black brute named Titan, one of the finest endurance horses money could buy. The animal's muscles rippled beneath a gleaming coat, his tack alone probably worth more than James' entire ranch. James didn't answer. Foster grinned, tipping his hat back. "Can't say I blame you for trying. After all, when you ain't got much, guess you gotta bet on miracles?" His men chuckled, their expensive horses shifting beneath them, nostrils flaring. Lily stood by the fence, arms crossed tight over her chest. "Ignore him of it," she said. "He's scared." Foster barked a laugh. "Scared? Of it?" He nodded toward Shadow. "Hell, I'll be surprised if the poor thing makes it past the first river crossing." James met his gaze, calm and steady. "We'll see." The announcer's voice crackled over the speakers. "Riders, to the line." James swung into the saddle. Shadow shifted beneath him but didn't flinch. He was ready. The starting gun fired. Titan exploded forward, his powerful legs eating up the ground. Foster leaned low in the saddle, already pulling ahead, his stallion's hooves thundering over the dirt. The other horses surged after him, their riders pushing hard. Shadow hesitated for just a heartbeat. The crowd, the noise, it was all new. But James gave him a steady squeeze. "Go on, boy." And Shadow ran. He wasn't the fastest at first. The bigger, stronger horses pulled ahead, their hooves kicking up clouds of dust. James didn't push. He let Shadow find his rhythm, let him remember what he was made for. The first 10 miles were a blur of hooves and sweat. Riders jostled for position, some already falling back, their horses spent from the hard start. James kept Shadow steady, letting him move just fast enough to stay in the middle of the pack. Up ahead, Foster was laughing, his stallion powering through the terrain like a machine. "Told you, Carter," he shouted over his shoulder. "You should have stayed home." Lily stood at the first checkpoint, fists clenched, eyes locked on Shadow. "Come on, boy," she whispered. Then came the river crossing. The water was deep, the current fast. Titan plunged in first, barely breaking stride as he powered through. Other horses followed, some hesitating, some floundering. James leaned low, guiding Shadow in. The Mustang hesitated for just a second. Then he surged forward. The water grabbed at them, pulling at Shadow's legs, but he pushed through. They emerged on the other side, soaked but steady. And that's when James gave the first signal. A light nudge. A shift in weight. Shadow responded. They picked up speed. One by one, they passed the struggling riders, moving up through the pack. Shadow's strides were smooth, controlled. He wasn't just running, he was conserving. He wasn't burning himself out like the others. By mile 20, they were in the top 5. By mile 30, they were third. By mile 40, they were right behind Foster. The rancher's smug expression had turned hard, his knuckles white around the reins. Titan was powerful, but he was also tiring. Foster had pushed him too hard, too early. James could feel Shadow beneath him, his breathing steady, his muscles still strong. This was what Mustangs were made for. Not short bursts of speed, but endurance. Survival. Mile 45. James eased forward in the saddle. "Let's show 'em, boy." Shadow surged ahead. The crowd at the final stretch erupted. Lily was screaming, fists pounding the fence. "Go, Shadow! Go, Dead!" Foster's face twisted in rage. He yanked the reins, digging his heels into Titan's sides. The stallion tried to respond, but his movements were sluggish. He had nothing left. Shadow flew past him. Foster's curses were drowned out by the roar of the crowd as James and Shadow crossed the finish line first. Silence hung for a moment. Then the announcer's voice rang through the speakers. "Winner, James, Carter, and Shadow." The stands exploded. Lily vaulted the fence, running toward them, tears in her eyes. James slid off the saddle just in time to catch her as she threw herself into his arms. "I knew he could do it." Foster dismounted stiffly, his face a mask of fury. His expensive stallion stood panting, head drooping, sides heaving. James met his glare with a calm, steady look. "Guess money doesn't buy everything," he said. Foster turned away without a word. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricked, eyes bright. He wasn't just the broken Mustang from the auction anymore. He was a champion. The final stretch of the race was chaos. Dust rose in thick clouds, kicked up by pounding hooves. The crowd roared, voices blending into a deafening wall of sound. Foster and Titan were still ahead, their lead shrinking but stubbornly holding. Shadow's breathing was steady, his strides long and smooth, while Titan's muscles twitched with exhaustion, his ears pinned back, his nostrils flaring wide. Foster glanced over his shoulder, his face twisting in disbelief as he saw James and Shadow closing the gap. He yanked the reins, spurring Titan harder. The stallion gave everything he had left, pushing forward with pure brute strength. But it wasn't enough. Shadow was still gaining. James didn't whip, didn't kick, didn't scream commands. He simply leaned forward, hands light on the reins, letting Shadow do what he was born to do. The Mustang's ears pricked, his strides growing stronger, his hooves barely touching the ground before launching forward again. Foster growled under his breath. "No, no, no, no." He dug his heels into Titan's sides, but the stallion's power was waning. Foster had pushed him too hard, too soon. 50 yards. Shadow pulled alongside. Titan's sides heaved like a bellows, sweat darkening his gleaming black coat. Foster's jaw clenched as he threw everything into the final sprint, forcing Titan to dig deeper, but Shadow was still fresh, still strong. The Mustang had held back when the others spent themselves. He had been waiting for this moment. 30 yards. Titan faltered, his stride breaking. Foster fought to keep control, his face red with frustration. 20 yards. Shadow surged past him. The crowd erupted. Lily was screaming herself hoarse, gripping the fence so tightly her knuckles were white. Ranchers who had once laughed at Shadow now stood frozen, mouths open, unable to believe what they were seeing. 10 yards. James exhaled slowly. "Go on, boy." Shadow thundered over the finish line. Silence. For a split second, the world seemed to stop. Then the announcer's voice cracked through the speakers. "Winner, James, Carter, and Shadow." The crowd exploded. Cheers rang out, hats were tossed into the air, and ranchers who had once mocked Shadow now watched in stunned silence. Lily vaulted over the fence, running full speed toward them. James barely had time to swing down from the saddle before she crashed into him, hugging him tight. "We won, Dad. We won." James laughed, breathless, resting a hand on Shadow's heaving neck. The Mustang stood tall, ears forward, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. He wasn't the trembling, broken creature from the auction anymore. Across the track, Foster pulled Titan to a rough stop. The stallion's head hung low, his legs shaking, his sides lathered in sweat. Foster threw his reins to one of his men and stomped toward James. "That was luck," he snapped, his voice sharp and bitter. "That was nothing but dumb luck." James met his glare, calm and steady. He wiped a hand over his dusty jeans, exhaled slowly, then looked Foster straight in the eye. "No, Foster," he said, his voice firm. "That was hard." Foster's lips curled, his hands clenching into fists, but he had no comeback. No smart remark. No insult to throw. He had lost, and worse, he had lost to a horse he once called worthless. The officials handed James the prize check, $10,000 in his calloused hands. Enough to save the farm. Enough to give Shadow the life he deserved. As James turned back to his Mustang, Lily grinned, brushing dirt from Shadow's coat. I bet they don't think he's worthless now. James chuckled, running a hand over Shadow's damp mane. No, he murmured. Not anymore. Next part 5000 character. The discarded Mustang had become a symbol of resilience and second chances. Shadow's journey proves that belief and patience can transform even the most broken souls. Also, you need to save the heroes you wrote about in the previous parts. Write to get a simple text without parts. Add more tension and humiliation. You also don't need to write, describe erotic scenes of various nature and kissing scenes or other 18+ scenes. ChatGPT. The days after the race were different. People looked at James and Shadow differently. The same ranchers who had once laughed at the Mustang now watched him with something close to respect, though some were too proud to admit it. Others still tried to downplay the victory, muttering that it was a fluke, that Foster's horse had just had an off day. But no one could ignore the truth. The discarded Mustang, the so-called worthless bag of bones, had beaten the finest horses money could buy. Foster, humiliated beyond words, left the race grounds without speaking to anyone. His expensive stallion, once a symbol of dominance, had been outmatched by a half-starved rescue. James knew it wasn't just about losing the prize money. It was about pride. Foster had built his reputation on being unbeatable, and now a no-name farmer and his auction reject had taken that from him. Back at the ranch, Shadow stood in his pasture, head high, his coat gleaming in the late afternoon sun. He looked nothing like the frail, beaten-down creature James had bought for $200. He was strong now, powerful, carrying himself with a quiet confidence he had never had before. Lily sat on the fence, tossing an apple toward him. Shadow caught it in his teeth, crunching down, his ears flicking forward at her laughter. Think he knows? She asked, swinging her legs. James leaned against the post, watching the Mustang chew. Knows what? That he won. That he's not the horse they thought he was. James considered that. He looked at Shadow, the horse who had once stood motionless in the auction pen, too tired to care if he lived or died. The same horse who had flinched at every touch, every movement. The same horse who had run not because he wanted to, but because he was trying to escape something he didn't understand. Now, Shadow didn't run from anything. Yeah, James said finally. I think he knows. But the world didn't forget so easily. Foster wasn't the kind of man who let things go. He had money, influence, and a bitter taste in his mouth that wouldn't go away. At the next auction, James heard the whispers. That the race had been a fluke. That he had gotten lucky. That a Mustang could never win again. At the feed store, the same old voices started up. Carter, you better enjoy that money while it lasts. You know lightning don't strike twice. James just smiled. He didn't have to prove anything to them. Shadow had already done that. But Foster wanted revenge. One afternoon, James and Lily returned from town to find a truck idling at the edge of the ranch. A man leaned against the side, arms crossed. Foster. James pulled the truck to a stop, stepping out slowly. Lily stayed inside, gripping the dashboard. Foster tilted his hat back. Heard you're ridin' high after that race, he said, voice sharp as a blade. Enjoying all the attention? James exhaled, resting a hand on his belt. Something I can help you with? Foster smirked. Actually, I got a proposition for you. He nodded toward the corral where Shadow stood, watching from a distance. That horse of yours, I'll buy him off you. Name your price. James' jaw tightened. He's not for sale. Foster chuckled. Come on, Carter. You're still just a broke farmer. 10 grand don't last forever. You got bills to pay, land to fix. That Mustang's worth something now, and I'm willin' to make a real offer. You'll never get a deal like this again. James shook his head. Not interested. Foster's smile faltered. Don't be stupid. That horse was nothin' before you got him. He's got a future now. With me, he'll have the best care money can buy. James glanced at Shadow, the Mustang's dark eyes locked onto them. He thought about the horse that had been cast aside, the one no one had wanted. He thought about the weeks of patience, the quiet moments of trust building, the first time Shadow had reached for him instead of pulling away. No, James said, his voice firm. He stays with me. Foster's expression darkened. You really think that nag's gonna do anything more? One race don't mean a damn thing. It does to him. Foster scoffed. Fine. But when that money runs out and you're struggling again, don't come crying to me. James watched as Foster climbed back into his truck, slamming the door shut. The tires spat dirt as he pulled away, leaving nothing but dust and empty threats. Lily leaned out the truck window. You think he'll be back? James sighed, rubbing his jaw. Probably. But it didn't matter. Because Shadow wasn't just a racehorse. He wasn't just a bet James had taken. He was something more. A symbol. A reminder that heart mattered more than money, that patience and belief could turn even the most broken soul into something unstoppable. And no amount of money could take that away.